nice talk. Even I learned a lot about that, although we talked about it a lot. I think since you've broken that talk down into these two pieces, one being basically more the research and development side of it, and the other more the clinical and deployment side, maybe we can approach two of these things from different angles. I think what was very interesting in the first part, in the research part, is the concept of having a classifier in that case being used as either a screening tool or basically a confirmatory test tool. And you delved a lot into this in quite some depth on the AUC curve, but I thought maybe we can also just share some thoughts about this, what that means in clinical context to either perform screening or to perform a confirmation test.
Yeah, that's obviously very, very important. So I think one element that's probably known to most people is the example of blood glucose. You know, like there's some people who have high blood glucose and some that have low. Some manifest the disease associated with that, some don't. And if you imagine that as two hills, somewhere you have to put a line to distinguish the one from the other group. If those two hills are completely separate with a valley in between, you can dream of the perfect diagnostic test or the test diagnostic threshold that separates the one group from the other. But unfortunately, in clinical practice, which handles a lot with nature and biological creatures, those are typically overlapping. When they're overlapping, you have to set the threshold somewhere to identify all of the one group or all of the other, or somewhere in between. If you put that threshold somewhere in between, you will obviously get false positives and false negatives. Now the idea of this, setting a diagnostic threshold is, you could say, I want to identify everyone with slightly too high blood glucose, and you set the threshold for identifying people with high blood glucose relatively low, almost to the upper limit of normal or even below that slightly. You would identify a lot of people with that disease manifesting, but you would also identify a lot that ate a little too much before blood draw, etc. So you would get a lot of false positives, yet you would identify the people manifesting the disease. Therefore, your test would be highly sensitive, but not very specific. In contrast, if you say, I only want to identify those people who definitely have the disease, I want to be very, very specific, and you set the threshold very high, you have a low number of false positives, and you be very specific, yet you will not identify or capture all the people with the disease. So I think this is a trade-off. Now in clinical practice, what's typically done is that you use two different technologies referred to as orthogonal methods, where you take one as a screening test, which is the first step, and then you couple the positively screened individuals with a highly specific test. Now both together will have an overall performance. That overall performance has to be better than whatever the gold standard was before you implemented this new test. Now we consider in this particular case is of this machine learning classifier that ultimately knowing about diagnostic test performance measures is rarely ever considering all the different components. And maybe to summarize this, if you think about the test itself, there's a pre-analytical, an analytical, and a post-analytical component. So if your test, let's stick with blood glucose or with these variants, has some sort of error before you do the test, that is definitely adding up in additional successive layers and will propagate further and ultimately decrease overall diagnostic test performance. So ultimately it's a composite problem of individual diagnostic measures, and that is largely not ignored, but it's not on the consciousness of people trying to deploy things in clinical practice.
Okay, very, very interesting. Maybe also what I found quite interesting was that towards the end of your talk, you kind of like showed this spider map and some of the complexity that basically occurs in clinical practice. So if we think from the perspective of a startup or maybe a research group that are either thinking about developing a new algorithm or that maybe have an algorithm that looks promising in their hands, what do you think, or what would you recommend these groups or these companies how to even approach the next step and trying to integrate this into clinical practice or getting that evaluated by some clinicians. Like at which point in the development process do you think they should reach out to clinicians or get consulting on that front? Or if they already have something that looks really promising, how could they do this practically?
So I think it's a two-part type question. One is, can I just ask who's having or is part of a startup in the room? And who's doing this, or who's doing mostly research or R&D in like a scientific lab or both? Can I ask what the background of the other people is? Just, I don't know, just shout it out.
So professional like I work in marketing, but I do market strategy for development solutions. Clinical validation.
Algorithms for ultrasound.
Medical devices design.
Yeah, so I'm sure you have your, interfaces where that's the person that I can trust, where you get information from. Where you say, well, this is what we're trying to do. Typically, the funding comes from somewhere. Like if you think about where your funding comes from, you made certain promises. So the first part is check whether the promises you made are actually aligned with what you're currently working on. That alignment is extremely important so that you have a paradigm to work for and against. Meaning, if you promise to cure cancer and you're working on some kind of small ramification and not on a therapy, there's like some disconnect. So getting that aligned is, more like some practical component that has to happen upfront. In practical steps, how you can get that information is, obviously a lot of people say you can read or you can hire people. What I would recommend is go talk to the people who you ultimately want to talk or sell your product to and see what they would need. Now in our case, when we're talking about a high complexity diagnostic test, you can come to us and portray your diagnostic technology. Typically you have some sort of documentation and we have a technology assessment team and we just take a look at this. This is not a very complex process. We just check whether it's ready for clinical practice. Now, these elements that I outlined are some of the components, but it definitely varies from use case to use case. And then the question is, what does your preliminary data look like, etc. So one common thing that we find, which it always reminds me of grad school, is people talk not a lot about controls, but ultimately what you have to be able to measure you against is the control. What is your standard reference, and then what do you improve? And if that's measurable, that's certainly something that we can look at. But I would say just send an email and come along.
But just to build on that, and I've spent years as a management consultant in sort of innovation ecosystems and trying to figure out how they evolve. And what I see in this one is I see a lot of companies like Third Rock Ventures and say Foundation Medicine, to me seem like are outbound in some sense, in that the money is coming into a company like Foundation, and then it's building a bunch of tests, and they're sort of putting them into the market. So they're sort of doing what you're talking about there, but they're kind of doing it pushed or something like that. And then I see you're sitting in Mass General, and if somehow we imagine you plus, 10 or something like that, you're like you could be. Like the thing you just talked about here is very informal. And I can't imagine it scaling very far, though it's great for people who could get to you. But I could imagine a world where there's lots of this stuff coming at Mass General. And in some sense there must be, right? Like if you're in oncology somewhere, you're getting them all the time. What's the process there for bringing it together? And then guys like these would have some place to plug in and be sort of trained more systematically.
So it's a great point. So if I understand it correctly, you're asking about scalability.
Of the relationship between between research and clinic, I guess.
So I think for larger scale, successful endeavors where you can minimize the risk and maximize the outcome, there are pathways like that. For example, Foundation Medicine, an amazing company, great tests, they have accomplished certain things that other people have spent decades not thinking about it. So full credit for that. On the other hand, I don't want to run a shop like that. We want to be innovative and we want to have smaller scale projects. We want to do tech assessment and help move it to the next step. Now, whether that can be scaled or not, we don't know. This concept has had some, I would say, tangible success stories, but definitely more failures. But we keep learning from the failures. Whether we can ever get all the failures accomplished in a, I don't know, unprepared delivery market, because that's what we try to serve, I don't actually know.
So maybe the failures are something to delve into a little bit more. So I think if we can avoid all the failures, we would definitely scale, because then every product would just be successful by definition. So maybe you could share a little bit of insight of, you mentioned some of the points of like how projects can fail, or how tools or devices can fail, or tests. But maybe like, what's your experience in terms of where do most people fail, or at which stage do they fail? Is it that kind of like the entire test is not designed well for the clinical question or the intended use, or is it some very technical aspects in terms of that it's like hard to reproduce the result in the laboratory, or difficult to run the algorithm and integrate it into an existing system? So what are kind of like the failure modes that you typically see with the tests that you've received for evaluation?
There's like probably, I mean, the pre-analytical definitely outweigh any of the teams that approach us, or some of the labs that are similar to us. They have done their homework. They know once to give them the input, the core technology of what they have developed, they usually are pretty good at. And that comes from probably years of failing internally before they actually reach out. And then that part is relatively solid, and they can give very specific features and demands on what the input should be. However, that is probably where, I don't know, one of the great examples was a protein-based assay that required about 2 grams of brain as an input for the reliable diagnosis of neurodegenerative disorders, so Alzheimer. Now, the test and the performance looks great, but who can give us 2 grams of brain, right? It may be great to have that as a diagnostic source material, but that, it's
true, sorry?
Yeah, it's not really applicable, because you have to purify a lot of protein to run this particular diagnostic assay. And then the question is, well, can we, scale this down? Can we do it in CSF? So there's a lot of promise, and it may ultimately work, but we don't even know where to start. I mean, we can go through the spider map and go through every single thing intended use. Great. We want to know whether someone has, a neurodegenerative disorder. If we can detect them early, we can run trials, etc. I would say this pre-analytical part is sometimes have a very, very small smidge of details. For example, we built this test with a different blood tube that is, a purple top versus a green top. And then not paying attention to that when rolling it out, then the question becomes, well, then we should give everyone our blood tubes. And then they should, if it doesn't work immediately, well, they should ship it to us, meaning the outside company. Now, just that workflow, which is all pre-analytical, is so tricky. If you imagine, have you ever followed the blood tube that you got drawn when you got a complete blood count in your physician's office? I mean, it's not going to be analyzed in your physician's office. What's the timeline? Someone had to test whether that blood tube can sit there from Friday morning till Monday morning and give a reliable result. So there has to be some sort of substrate in that blood tube that makes it possible to determine whether your liver function is working or not. It's all these minute details that some healthcare implementation specialists think about that are typically coming after the fact. So you may have the best liver function test, best or fastest product on the market, cheaper than anyone else, or microfluidics device that does X, Y, Z. But then the source material is always fresh blood from some sort of commercial source, but you can't get it in the same configuration.
So maybe since the topic is primarily AI, I think some of these problems become particularly apparent talking about software. because like the classifier that you presented, I think that this diagram started with the VCF file. So this is already digital world. All the extraction of the DNA, all the preparation, all of that has already happened. And now we're starting basically from that file and we inspect the performance of the algorithm. How does that work within the hospital? If there is now an algorithm, and I assume typically you would have an AI company working on the algorithm and improving the algorithm, how do you account for that pre-test, if we consider the test now just being the AI algorithm, how would you even account for the pre-test variability in the development or deployment phase of your algorithm?
Just in full disclosure, this algorithm that we built would not be able to be transferred in another lab without a lot of documentation. Right? So, I don't know, I can't tell you the solution for that yet, but the word I think that comes to mind is interoperability, and that comes immediately with the data model, meaning there's no unified data model for machine learning in medicine. You know, everyone kind of puts their key value pairs, their column titles, their names together, and it makes, I would say, most of the time intuitive sense. But if you think about your variables when you start versus 2 years in the project, they probably have transformed tremendously, and you wouldn't recognize that if someone would have shown you traveling back in time 2 years ago. So I think that shows that that development is completely, not completely, but it's unpredictable. But what's needed is obviously healthcare standards. Now, if you're in a startup or in a research lab and you want to build something, you start thinking like, I'm just going to build that from scratch. I mean, you know, you have worked with that, and a lot of people do this, but who wants to read through a dry ISO standard document? You know, that's like 200 pages explaining a certain connector and which cables run which data in what time frame. Yet ultimately, the latest when you want to plug your tool, if it needs electrical current into a plug, you have to comply with certain standards, because otherwise you never get a CE certificate, etc. So I mean, those components are true for the data as well as the real world. But when it comes to like the actual clinical grade data, those live typically in data silos maintained by large healthcare IT providers, I should say.
So maybe you showed that figure from, I think, the Forbes magazine,
Yes.
where it's like 80% of the data science time is actually spent on preparing or extracting data rather than actually the algorithm development itself. So now you assume that in clinical practice, that's all clinical grade data. So that fraction should rather be smaller than if you consider like just data off the internet. In your experience, how does it look like in clinical practice? Would you say that what the Forbes magazine put out there from like, I would say like data scientists out from the wild compared to data scientists in like a clinical hospital setting? Do you think it's rather more or rather less time?
Definitely more.
Definitely more time.
It's, you know, I mean, if you have a software company right now and you want to go into a hospital, you have to have an API team, because you will not have the time to build all the connectivity between certain outputs and your software and the inputs. You have to convert data. You have to know what data format is that in. If someone puts in a, I don't know, alphanumeric field, just numbers, that may screw up certain components, how you build it. And all these components are typically, or when we're confronted with that, or how we're confronted with that, is a company comes in and says, we can solve everything. We have a database, we build an API, we pull the data, we store them, we have a web interface that you can link to from anywhere, anyhow, and it will give you a performance metrics, and we would even specify what it looks like to the point of color and shape and tables. The problem is none of that would fit into our spider map in terms of, well, let's assume we put patient data in there. They can't even leave the hospital. Like, we can't put them in the cloud. Well, yeah, then, you know, arguments come, well, we have a safe environment, it's HIPAA compliant, etc. Okay, but that means you have to have audit, you know, trials of like, who checks this? Who has access to it? It's like SOC 2 standard. And then usually you hear crickets in the teleconferences when you mention something like that. And it's like, you know, and then it's clear that that's a completely different infrastructure. And then talking about, you know, the actual data that are shared, we can build you any tool you want. Okay, well, what tool? Well, whatever you want. And then it's like not only the data extraction tool and the data management, the data storage, and the model building, but it's also how it's delivered and what you should do about it. So this is like a company that has six different business areas and claims to have engineering experience in each one of those. And the first interaction is then, well, who do you have who can build an API with our hospital information system? And then comes, well, we need this field. And then it starts like getting, you have experienced some of that. It's, the devil is in the detail, but it's so deep in the detail that you have to go through 3 hours of phone calls to actually get to someone who can explain what's actually needed. And then usually it breaks apart there, but I don't have a standard answer for that. So to come back to your question, that's probably one of the biggest hurdles right now for us.
Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the timing of approaching you guys, because to me it seems like everybody that comes to you has perfect solutions, but they fail on one thing, they don't understand what you need. And so while they were developing their perfect solution, they could also co-develop or have like one guy that is trying to figure out all of those nuts and bolts. Because you're saying that they are not, they are impossible to achieve, you just need to think about them.
Correct.
But we can think about them without actually thinking your brain first. Or you telling us that, no, that's not the way we do it. But then we are already like burning the last $1 million of our capital and and then things starts happening quite fast. So what's the step before having an actual clinical trial where we still can, get that input that?
We do a lot of, I'm always complaining about that, and yet I'm sitting here asking for it, but there's a lot of free consultation, and I think you know what I mean with that. It's just like coming and seeing, because we don't know all the technologies that we may need next year. So we definitely have an overhead of just talking to a lot of companies, and we learn quite a bit. And then, the next step is then typically putting a CDA in place, and then we can talk, also sharing certain components. We have that with a lot of companies. And some even saying, well, I don't think this is the right track, but I think for exploring what we need to do, and at some point the scaling of a company benefits from those smaller scale solutions rather than going for the big pharma immediately. Because to become too corporate too early is also preventing some progress. So I'm always happy to listen and to talk to them. We have you saw the org chart, we have quite a team. So to give you a concrete example, we have several people who just want nucleic acid extraction be done at a clinical grade. And they approached us early, even before they had anything started. Like, they want to do some, microRNAs and RNA sequencing. And they said, we know you guys do this in clinic. Can we get your extraction? And it's like, what is that? What does that entail? And ultimately, after going through this whole thing, they said, well, can you just extract it? Because we don't want to be in the business of RNA extraction. And ultimately, it will come from you, or it may come from you if we choose, or the clinician collaborates. And that kind of like initial component is, or what I meant with saying, like, if you want to ultimately sell it or market it to some person, think about it, where would he get that nucleic acid from? I mean, it's not as if the clinicians at MGH walk around and say, hey, I have, an RNA extraction team. So in a way, it's also like an infrastructure that we can provide.
And I think maybe just adding to this, it's like integrating into clinical care. What we see with a lot of solutions that are basically being proposed is that they're trying to replace an entire chunk of the system. So maybe also just before trying even to put that into practice, like informing yourself very well of like what does the environment currently look like? Like what other IT systems, for example, are in place that you may need to interact with. Because it is, like if you're proposing to change the entire electronic health record of a huge hospital, that's like a major decision that won't be made from one day to another and just to get your algorithm to run, for example. So I think that is kind of like one thing is like if you have a solution, only do the solution and not try to cover everything else that is already in place, because that will be very difficult for hospitals to then actually adopt that.
I would like to add something to what you're saying. It still feels, I think, especially when we have like a snapshot of the data, like let's say radiology or something. The progress is obvious and it's clear and it's fast done. But things become more complicated when you go into the quote unquote the web materials and stuff. And then I think the first, I don't even know what is the first item. When I look all the data, they come from these huge EHR systems that were never meant to collect data for diagnostics. They are built in terms of billing, okay? You just timing things, and then you can put a price, and you can charge the government insurance, whatever, okay? Now, of course, clinicians can look at that and extract information, I mean, it's a linear thing, patient by patient, or you could get, groups of people and say, it was never meant, like, to do it. So we've spent an enormous time on trying to, quote unquote, to clean the data, to make it appropriate so we can run this algorithms and see if we can extract something out of it. And perhaps the third problem that I see is that depending upon where you went to medical school, and in this country it's clearly, there are at least 3 big sets, right? People might not, talk the same thing, okay? So we have to, stop and build ontologies, clear elements, so we're going to speak the same language, right? And then I think perhaps we can start thinking, what can we as, data analysts and people with the boots on the ground can work with its institutions, okay, and then create a better system. I mean, other than that, I think I see another 10 years for us to just, going through the muck. I mean, I see very little incentive in terms of, progressing in an organized way.
Great comment. You're great. I like it. Well, I sign this. Maybe you should go into politics. I mean, this is exactly what's needed, right? We need a centralized system and all of that, but that will definitely have its own problems, right? I fully agree that electronic medical records promise a lot and they contain a lot of information and they can be mined, but whether they were initially built for that or more for documentation at a time, linear scale pattern, I mean, those are different functionalities. I think it's a dream that they can accomplish all of what we need, but I think, the backwards compatibility is a problem. If you do any kind of study, you know there's going to be empty data points, like not every patient got a CT scan, so you will automatically bias your population or your reference chart. I mean, maybe one of the current proposals in the government, the National Medical Identification Number may help with that, so that people ultimately will start developing systems where you can access, universal health record. But that comes with problems as well, because not everyone may want that. So I think it's a careful balance, but your points are well taken.
Yes, please.
Can you just ask questions? Or
Yeah.
So my question, I have a pre-question before I ask my question. So my pre-question is, can we patent algorithms?
That is, so you're talking about software algorithms. I think there's a substantial difference if you look across the world. So I think in the US you can do patent certain software solutions. In Europe it's different. You have to have a real world component that is attached to it. Now therefore the question is always, what does the patent entail and how far does it reach? The question about patenting or licensing or any of those components is what you use to actually do it. I would say for most software solutions nowadays, it's very hard to claim that unique invention step, because you have to be able to document that. Now the documentation, like some sort of writing, when did you make that invention? When it comes to the physical real world, the traditional way of saying a numbered, pre-numbered lab book with a date and saying, not only that I made this discovery on February 12th or 13th, but I made that discovery because of the following 16 other experiments, or that you can actually conceivably prove, or that you made that invention. That is very hard to do in the current software environment. Now, having said that, there are tons of applications on that, but I think it's much easier to reach that when you put some sort of design feature to it. So it's easier to make that part and parcel of a product. And I think that it gets more into a realm that I'm not too familiar with. But when we look at certain technologies, we always ask, like, who owns this, or is there a patent? But that's outside. Do you know a little more about the software?
Yeah, typically, if you couple it to hardware, it becomes easier. That's like my understanding. So if you have a physical device, like a sequencer, and then you have a sequence analysis software, and you patent this together, it becomes easier. If the software is standalone, then particularly now in the AI space, since everybody uses kind of neural networks for things, you would really need to prove where the inventive step basically was and how that is very specific to one application. And I'm not an expert in that either, but it's definitely something probably that would be worth, if you aim for that, to approach an expert in that field early on, to then kind of like also decide whether that patent will be more on the training side of the algorithm, whether there's any novelty of how you trained it, or whether there's any novelty of how, when you deploy it, how it can be used and consumed, or whether it does any new ways in a very specific intended use. I think.
Maybe one thing to round this up, if you have Photoshop and you start Photoshop, there's sort of a paragraph version with these 9 to 12 digit numbers. Those are the patent IDs for that particular version. If you take those and Google those, you get into this maze of interconnected patents, because they can purchase certain software algorithms and they patented some of these tools that are used completely, I think mostly in the pixel realm or pixel modification, or color realm and color space. It's a completely separate field. That was your pre-question,
That was
right?
my pre-question.
That's the actual question.
And now,
Because I'm trying to understand for a startup or a smaller organization to sort of work on this, the return on investment for an algorithm that's a diagnostic algorithm as opposed to like a therapeutic. Like if you think about the work that needs to go into validating the efficacy of the diagnostic solution, is maybe not as serious or as involved as a drug, but it's pretty similar. Like you have to run the studies to show efficacy and show that, as you were showing, that it's positive in X number of patients. And then, so the amount of investment is similar. Maybe therapeutics is definitely more. But then on the other hand, in terms of tangible things that you can hold on to, if there are fewer patents, and then you have to publish to sort of have credibility, and then a lot of the supplementary information has most of your algorithm and some of the pieces. Like, how do you approach this whole problem? Like, how do you encourage people?
Yeah, it's a very good question. That is much easier than the first one. So the how to approach this is relatively straightforward. So in terms of your return on investment, you want to get reimbursed from someone. Either you have certain strategies, like grants, etc. But when it comes to hardcore clinical practice, the American Medical Association releases these current procedural terminology codes, or CPT codes. If the field that you're in doesn't have a CPT code, you cannot get reimbursed. It's a necessary but not sufficient requirement. So you have to have a CPT code that you can attach your utility or whatever you want to claim to. Now, when it comes to these algorithms, it's very tricky which CPT codes to use, and each subspecialty has their own. I can give you an example, and it's kind of similar to your first question. That's why it's interesting. If you tie the algorithm to an analyte, meaning something that's analyzed, and it can be, at least that's my understanding, also be electronic medical record information, meaning personal health information. There's a set of specific codes called multi-analyte and algorithmic analysis codes, MAAA codes. These are given out to certain algorithms codes that are, again, typically linked to multiple analytes. There's a couple of commercial examples for that. For example, Oncotype DX in breast cancer, or you can look them up. They're specifically applied to by certain companies with an intended use and these specific codes. That is one avenue that you can immediately pursue if you can tie it to an analyte and or an algorithmic analysis. That would be the necessary component, but then you have to talk to payers and show what you just mentioned, that you're clinically useful, that you improve something. Now that improving something, that needs to be predefined. So you have to basically solve the problem while you apply for it, and that's okay. So you get an investigational status, but that's a 1 or 2 year process, and typically it's tied to that technology, whatever it is. Now those pathways you can basically pursue in parallel to your other developments, but what the timing of that is and when to take that risk to go through that process, I would say you can check certain companies release their timelines, because they're, at some point they're very proud that they get 510K clearance, and you can check. Those are the typical milestones that they have on their product development path. And it's a feasible path, but it has very little to do with the, it's more like the regulatory environment. So most of the time when we're talking about small startups with an R&D division that's heavy, small marketing, they will hire that through regulatory and or external affairs consultants. But that's certainly a pathway to accomplish that, but that's at the very end, I would say, towards clinical integration. So the parts before typically are third party or NIH or external funds. So, did that answer the question? Yeah.
You mentioned reimbursement. My question is there a way to convince a clinician to use some tool in his practice, for example, non-invasive imaging such as ultrasound, if there is really no way for him to get reimbursement, just by convincing him that this is good for his practice, for his patient, maybe speeding up his process, maybe releasing the patient earlier. I mean, a stethoscope. Do you get reimbursement for stethoscope test? I'm not sure.
Second answer to the second question. Not specifically for the stethoscope test, but for certain physical examinations, which is the diagnostic procedure, the examination should entail that. But that's a very, very complex question. But yes, there are reimbursement codes for things like that. So you're basically asking whether if you convince someone to offer the test for free, whether that would work. That's again a very loaded question, because there's certain legal requirements at the federal, meaning national, or even the state level that prevent that. So you can't just offer certain things for free. It's like a non-compete clause that, a certain practice can't just say, we offer CT scans for free to get more patients, right? It will be just...
Legally? Why not?
I'm not too familiar with all the legal requirements, but that is a non-viable possibility, because the free offering of diagnostic tests, I don't know, it's just my interpretation, is considered permitting over-testing, right? Because then you suddenly start doing this. Now there are numerous exceptions to this, so I'm not a legal expert in this matter, but I know that that's a common request. Researchers say, well, can't we just run exome on everyone? And yes, there are certain exceptions, but for example, you would have to obtain informed consent. Because certain patients may not want this if it's an unproven technology. So in a way, a lot of these elements try to ensure safety and efficacy, that it actually works.
I have a sort of follow-up on both of them in a way, which is, when you ask your first question, I have some software patents. I've been through the horrible process of it. But it sounded like you were seeing it from the standpoint of a software product business, or a business that wants to license the software. Okay? And what I'm hearing is that's a difficult model in this world, but because it's a service reimbursement world. So in some sense, the way you were talking about it in the second part of the question was, well, you could essentially set up a service for us, like a diagnostic lab. Like you can become like a baby Quest Diagnostics, run your test, and then we'll get a reimbursement code for the tests. And then the physician is really kind of a reseller in a way of a set of complementary services. So the business model has to be more of a service model, which I think is not typically how people in the software world, my own world, tend to. I mean, they do think about software as a service, but not quite in the same way. And it sort of seems similar in this one. The follow-up question was kind of the same point, which is, like, who are you? Well, again, the physician is selling his or her services to the insurance companies or the government, and then if you're bringing your thing in, they're going to have to either bundle it into theirs or find a reimbursement for you to pass it through or something.
So maybe if we slightly reformulate that, it's also how can an algorithm or an AI tool add value in clinical practice? And add value maybe on the one hand side in terms of actually benefiting a patient, but on the other side, adding value also in like actually getting real money from that, both for the developers of the algorithm, but then also for the consumers, which in the case of diagnostics would probably be the lab. So maybe we can, if we take the algorithm that you presented at the beginning, the variant caller, so now you're using this in clinical practice. It's maybe how does the algorithm add value to your workflow from a patient perspective, but maybe also from a laboratory or hospital perspective?
That's an interesting question. So initially we thought there's time savings, right? That you have another decision support that builds on our collective experience. Then we said, well, we want the explore function to actually understand why the decisions are made, and then we found that obviously people spend time looking at the decisions, which that is not time. So it's not as high as we initially anticipated, but on average I think it's a few minutes. The thing why I think it adds value personally when looking at variants is you have yet another tool that you can look at. Now you can also completely ignore it. Certain variants that are always flagged by the model, we know they're wrong calls, but it makes us feel good. We look at it and we say, oh yeah, that's look, the machine made an error. Kind of more like it completely changed my view of what machine learning and AI can do, because it becomes kind of like a reality. It's like there, I can look at it every single day. That's not really a value added to patient care, but it's value added to the users of that tool.
So maybe coming back to your question, if there would be a tool that would primarily help physicians make better decisions, or maybe just give them more confidence in their decision, do you think they would be willing to basically pay for that out of their own pocket, just to make sure that they're actually delivering the right decision or reporting the right decision?
Yeah, that's a very good example, and there are certain market sectors in that realm. For example, some private practice physicians, they have point-of-care devices that they hand over to patients to perform a certain diagnostic test. They invest in that to offer the service. It comes back to your point. Thereby, the physician is empowered to have something. Ultrasound is a great example. If you have a gastroenterologist, they will likely have an ultrasound device just to take a look when they want to. It's kind of like in the complex diagnostic workspace of a physician, you cannot potentially force the physician to use one diagnostic tree all the time. It is too diverse, and so that is also something that, for example, the FDA doesn't have regulatory oversight over. They can regulate devices and everything, but how that's applied, considered in parentheses, in clinical practice or in clinical reality, that is up to a physician and up to human decision making. And in a certain moment, the physician, and I just know this from medical school, so in an ER setting, people don't think about billing codes or whether this is reimbursed or whether that service fits the ICD diagnosis. If that's needed, that's provided, right? So it's like kind of there's a ton of exceptions. Now building treatment workflows for assessing the advents or problems with certain technologies in such a complex decision tree up front is essentially impossible. So therefore that intended use rule is pick one setting and show that it works there. Thereby you get the entrance into medical practice, and then people will gain understanding and will become competent, and then suddenly use it for something completely different. So I think it's almost like how do you get the foot in the door? And when it comes to software, I think the problem in the medical space is to find out who your customer actually is. It's very, very difficult because you may sell the software to the hospital leadership. It's used by a provider and the benefit is going to a patient. Now, who should pay for that? Right? And then, well, the payment comes from a payer. The payer says, we have nothing to do with it. No one asked us. And that is creating this, it's almost like, 6, 7 vantage points on one thing that only makes sense if you find the right setting for that where everyone says, yes, I like that, yes, I like that. And that is almost like a consensus rule. And achieving that requires input from everyone. I think that is something that may work if you have a lot of money, a lot of consultants, and check this out. But I think that's the exception. Most of the things are, smaller scale operations. Yes?
I'm not so sure I agree completely with you. An algorithm is a one-cell element. Okay, it lives in itself.
I like cells.
Nowhere. Now, what we really need is better questions. Okay, once we have very good questions, okay, we can go to these unicell elements and say, okay, answer me. And if it's not good enough, get a better one, right? And I think we are sort of, because it's easier to create an algorithm than ask the right questions. Because asking the right questions, we have to start with a sort of domain knowledge that perhaps exists or doesn't exist. And maybe we think we are making the best and most educated questions, and maybe it's not the right, it's not enough. And so I think we need a little bit of balancing. I think we are, relegating a lot of power for algorithms, and it's a little bit dangerous to do that, because then algorithms become, the concept of using algorithms is like snake oil, and I hate to think that we might get there.
Maybe just also to expand on, an algorithm on itself it's not really viable. I mean, the algorithm is like a concept, right? It's like, but to deliver that, the algorithm needs to become software. And for the software to be useful, it needs to become accessible through some tool that somebody can use, like an interface you can click on, or you can even like ask your question. So a lot of the problems is that we have algorithms that are capable to answer certain questions, but we don't really know how to connect the question with the answering tool.
The algorithms ask questions, I'm sorry. The algorithms answer questions.
Yeah, but we have a problem. We have people in the clinic who have questions, and we have some tools that are capable of answering some of these questions. But the algorithm by themselves, like they need some vehicle to even able to like address these questions or to hear these questions. And that's often where things become very difficult in practice, because it's kind of like, whom do you sell that algorithm to? You could sell this to a device manufacturer who then actually delivers that to you through this device, or you could bring it through some mobile phone app or something, but you need some vehicle for the algorithm to even like hear the question or be able to answer to it.
But you see, you already answered. You said, to whom I sell this algorithm? Well, you're going to sell it to someone that has a particular question. And therefore, it is, let's say, the best tool at that point.
Maybe I can.
The algorithms are always responding to something.
So let me give you an example. Let's say the question is, what time is it? And did we run over yet? Right? You could say a clock. A clock would be a use case for the time to delineate that. You could also say there's a benefit. If you had set an alarm that would go off, then the benefit would be we all know whether we went over or not. Both of these are applications, right? You would apply a certain thing to that particular question. And I think what we're trying to say is you can approach the topic by asking very, very specific and relevant questions, and then build your use case or your benefit around it. Or you can start with the benefit and or just the application. I'm a very good coder now, and I can write a machine learning tool. Who needs this? That's a market, and you can just apply it. I think you can approach the same problem in a triangle from each side. The question, the solution in terms of the use case, or the benefit. And each one of those will ultimately lead to a result if you account for all the other two.
I'm not, it's not a matter of, I agree or not, it's just, in practice, like we get confronted by, both of them all the time. And the thing is using this particular tool answering better, or should I stop and just do it again and then create an algorithm and just, because this is not working, it is sort of, catch-22 at this point.
Who would have thought I go to the AI for the rest of us and I would end up in a philosophical discussion?
Thank you.
So what does our AI tool say on the time?
Because late. Maybe we can take one more question if anyone want to finish the question.
The role for laboratory validated or developed tests tools when it comes to software is. So where do you see like that as a kind of intermediate step? Taking something into the clinic, you find it useful, then partners collaborate, validate internally. How does that fit into your integration view?
The laboratory developed test industry itself is I think, largely misunderstood field. There's a lot of discussions and seeming controversies about the dangers of laboratory developed tests. I think that entire field, currently there's a proposed bill called the Valid Act, currently on the path towards Congress to revolutionize that entire field by introducing a core element called the pre-certification process. Thereby, individual developers or tests or laboratories would require to undergo a pre-certification process to actually administer certain tests. Simply put, they have to get a driver's license. And then once they have a driver's license, they are audited, and if they change vehicle types, they would kind of redo it, but that's kind of the idea. I think that's actually a really good thing. The question is how operationally that would work in clinical practice. There's hundreds of thousands of tests out there that are laboratory developed tests. And while there's a certain component of lobbyists that tries to kind of trash that field and say, oh, this is all not regulated, that is actually completely the opposite of what's happening in a clear laboratory environment. Clinical grade tests are usually developed by people who are really careful, and they have to, you saw this, right? They undergo proficiency testing, competency, there's HR requirements, there's credentialing, a lot of stuff that I didn't go into. An entire compliance process in companies, in commercial labs, as well as in clinical settings that maintains a quality standard. Now, do mistakes happen? Yes. Will the pre-certification process maintain that in clinical practice? I'm not sure. I don't know what that would look like. And when it comes to the part of your question focusing on the software, there's like a whole set of guidance documents. I know Marcus read a lot about that, so I will give him some minutes to answer that. Basically considering software as a medical device. Now that guidance document is a very complex, outline of what will need to be regulated. But I think it comes to that part that we are kind of unprepared what that would look like. And it is typically then again narrowed down to one specific use case to actually narrow down the scope, because otherwise it would be so impossible to regulate unless you specify it in a very narrow angle. And I think for many companies that's actually really tricky, because the scope of what they're working on is generally larger than one specific use case. And then the performance may be actually relatively broad and good, but when you narrow it down to one specific question, the limitations become relatively clear. And then the question is whether you want to take that risk. But Marcus, you want to say something about?
Yeah, I think the laboratory developed test world is kind of difficult on the one hand side because, as George just mentioned, all of this is currently undergoing some changes in terms of regulation. but also in terms of definition. So if you're very strict, a laboratory developed test is defined as something that was designed, manufactured, and delivered by one laboratory under one, what is called like a clear certificate. So that is now in collaboration with, like, let's say, an outside company or even like a research lab. Strictly speaking, that is no longer a laboratory developed test. So that's kind of like the one thing, is if it even is a laboratory developed test by definition. And then the other aspect is that the FDA has regulatory oversight, even over laboratory developed tests, but it didn't enforce that. It kind of like performed enforcement discretion over the last years. But as they've recently shown, is where they went after a few labs, that doesn't mean that they will actually follow through on it. So if they wanted in principle, I think they could at least try to like regulate this more strictly. How this will then now evolve over the next couple of years when it comes to AI is something that we will probably have to see. So also here, a test or an in vitro diagnostic test, per definition, is a medical device. And if it's software, it would be software as a medical device. So as such, there are very extensive guidelines of how that would need to be, what would need to be in place to basically fulfill the requirement of that regulatory framework. But I think for now, we just have to probably wait a little bit longer. And I think there are now the first algorithms also currently undergoing FDA review. So probably in a few months or years, we will know like how the FDA actually then regulated those. I think a lot of them currently go through the de novo pathway or through the approval pathway, and we'll probably learn like and learn from these examples of how things will then actually be regulated in practice.
Thank you, Dr.